So welcome. This is our, I don't know what number class we're at, but continuing series on chapters 4 and 5 of Master Shantideva's text. So let's go ahead and begin, as we usually do, with the prayers that we recite before the teaching. So we'll do the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha, this homage 3 times. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And let's do the refuge and bodhicitta. Oh, sorry, the mandala offering first. It's kind of nice to do that. Thinking about all of our gurus and creating that kind of strong connection with them by making this vast, pure offering, visualizing the entire phenomenal world transformed into a beautiful paradise, a Buddha land, a pure land, symbolic of our own future enlightenment and the enlightenment of all beings. So we're making that vast, pure offering so that we can receive the blessings of our gurus and all the holy beings and become just like them. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun, and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then refuge in bodhicitta before the teaching, solidifying as best as we can these 2 thoughts of heartfelt refuge, finding safe direction in the 3 jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and then also generating the motivation of bodhicitta that we'll meditate on shortly, but already having this thought that we're together, listening to the Dharma, engaging in these teachings so that we can benefit all sentient beings by becoming a Buddha ourselves. We'll do this once in English, twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chunyen gi pe sonam gi, dola penchir sangye drupar shok, sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chunyen gi pe sanam gi, dola penchir sangye drupar shok. Okay, let's do a short meditation then before we begin the class. Just give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit and then to generate a good motivation together. So find a good meditation posture, one that works for you. And relaxing into this posture as best as you can. You can begin to tend to the breath when you're ready. Again, most of you have ways that you already work with the breath. And if that's so, you can use that for the next few minutes. If not, again, I generally suggest the area of the nostrils where we feel the air coming in and out. And the goal there is to stay present with that sensation as best as you can, to not let the mind wander. And in any of our meditations on the breath, we need this factor that we're studying about to some degree, what we call our guarding alertness or introspection, this part of the mind that is checking in to see the quality of our mind. If we see at the time when we check in that we've lost the meditation object, that we've wandered away somewhere else, then we acknowledge that and we bring the mind gently back to the breath. So again, we'll just do this in silence for a few minutes. I'll ring the bell to start that meditation period. And then after a few minutes in silence, I'll lead you in a short reflection to set your motivation for tonight. So now let's set our motivation for doing some additional teachings on this topic that Shantideva is teaching us, generating the motivation of bodhicitta. And as I frequently do, I like to remind everyone of just this amazing opportunity that each of us possesses right now. This is one of the first topics in the stages of the path teachings, this recognition of the preciousness of this human life that we possess. And there are many people who died today, who have died in the days between the last time we met and today, but we have not. We still have this human existence. This human existence, as we've touched upon a number of times in Shantideva's text, is filled with what are called the freedoms and the endowments or opportunities. The fact that we are free from various states that would have made this life not so favorable. And we are also endowed with many qualities that help us to make the most of this life. So every one of us is here because we currently possess those qualities. And with an interest in the Dharma, it's important then that we make sure that we do use this human existence as best as we can, because there is no guarantee that we will have another day in this human life. The very first thing that we want to focus on is the temporal value of this life, the fact that we can create the causes through our coming together like this, studying the Dharma, practicing the Dharma, to at least have an assurance that at the end of this life we will continue to have good existences, continue to be able to partake of the Dharma and develop our minds and our hearts. This is the first level of motivation, seeing the temporal value of this human life. But there's also an ultimate value to this human life, and kind of two stages of that. The first is to recognize that we can attain the state of nirvana, peace. We can once and for all put an end to all of our suffering, all of our dissatisfaction, by removing all of what obscures our minds currently in terms of the afflictions and their seeds, by being completely free from all of that and the karma that is built upon that, we then can know true peace. We can no longer be plagued by these delusions, by all the suffering of samsara and so on. And this is a final result. When we attain this, it's not that we, ever revert from that back to the state of some samsara and suffering. Instead, we continue to abide in a state of complete freedom, the state of nirvana, peace. This is the first recognition of the ultimate value of this human life, is that we can use it to attain that state. We can use the time we have together to attain the peace of nirvana. But as we know from these Mahayana teachings, and especially by studying this text, this isn't the final result. There is another level of ultimate value to this human existence, which is the recognition that we can attain enlightenment on this basis. We can go beyond just our own peace to attain the state of Buddhahood, a state where we will then be able to benefit all sentient beings, motivated by a deep compassion for them, a sincere wish to free them from their suffering, as well as a loving kindness for them that wants them to be in complete happiness, complete well-being. On the basis of those thoughts of being concerned about the welfare of others, we cultivate that altruistic motivation, thinking that we're here to work on ourselves, especially by learning about the perfection of morality that we're exploring more tonight through this 5th chapter. One of the 6 paramitas, these 6 ways to transcend beyond our current limitations to attain the state of a Buddha. So we want to do this with ideally this motivation of bodhicitta, the sincere wish to be of greatest benefit to all beings by developing ourselves fully. And as Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, with the mind of bodhicitta, all the other goals that we were wishing for ourselves, are there by the way. They will arise without a doubt. We will have the peace of liberation, nirvana. We will have good rebirths. We will even have happiness in this life if we turn our minds towards the welfare of all beings and generate bodhicitta. As Rinpoche also says, the real sun of happiness begins to shine when we cherish other beings. So hold that very altruistic motivation deep in your heart tonight for this teaching, as well as through the remainder of today, this week, this year, this life, and beyond, all the way to enlightenment. Okay, wonderful. So let's just do a brief recap of where we're at in this study. Again, just as a reminder for the future, we're planning on continuing over the next several Mondays, and hopefully we'll be finished by around May 18th. That's my plan, is to go through the remainder of Chapter 5. So it's about, after tonight, 4 more Mondays, I believe. So far what we've done is we concluded Chapter 4, which is all about conscientiousness, about this factor of our minds that kind of keeps us aware of what it is that we need to be doing. It acts as a sort of conscience, keeps us on track in terms of trying to abandon non-virtue to engage in virtue. But now we're looking at the more specific factors that are operative, particularly when it comes to our behavior in terms of our minds as well as our body and speech. In this Chapter 5 on introspection or guarding alertness, we're looking at how we need these factors, that factor in particular that keeps an awareness of what we are doing more specifically to make sure that we don't go astray, but then also mindfulness, the holding on to what it is that we're intending to do, the practice of virtue, the avoidance of non-virtue, and so on. Of course, these factors play a role in a lot of our practice of Buddhism, but especially in regard to morality. Again, morality being the second of the 6 perfections. This is after generosity is said to be the next more difficult, and then after this will be patience, which will be even more difficult to practice, and then they say joyous enthusiasm is more difficult, concentration even more, and wisdom the most difficult of these 6. So again, there are chapters for each of these going forward, except generosity. We saw a little bit about generosity previously, but we're going to see that kind of being brought into the 10th chapter on dedicating. So we are in the 5th chapter, as I said, in the main part of this chapter where we're looking at the specific practices that are around going into the practice of morality. Recall that when we first began the text, there was a general presentation, then there's this individual presentation, which is all of the verses, the 109 verses in this chapter. The first outline within this is explaining extensively how to practice, and we saw that that had 4 outlines. We are actually already in the 3rd. The 3rd outline of these is where we do look at the practice of guarding the mind with mindfulness and introspection. How do we actually make sure that we protect our minds so that then the behavior that follows, because everything starts with the mind, will be in accord with what we want to accomplish. So this is divided into, this is again verses 34 through 97, divided into 3 parts that mirror the 3 types of morality or ethics. I'm going to be using those interchangeably. So the very first one is where we kind of introduced this last week, and I'm going to continue with that and get into the verses. And I'm hoping to accomplish a good part of the verses in regard to the morality of restraint, refraining from misdeeds, negative actions, misbehavior, breaking our vows, what have you. Then we'll go on to the training in the morality of accumulating virtuous dharmas, how we actually engage in virtuous activity that helps us to accumulate merit. And then training in the morality that accomplishes the welfare of sentient beings, that is about benefiting them, because this is the Bodhisattva's practice, is we don't just sit and try to engage in virtue on our own. We want to also be in the virtuous activities that are there to benefit individual beings, to help them to have the happiness they seek temporally as well as ultimately. So I introduced this last week. I'm just going to show one slide from what we did last week, which is the way that, this is also in your handout, the handout that's for this course that you should have. I don't recall what page it's on, but this is the first of these 3. The ethics of restraint from faulty behavior is what it was called in the presentation in this other commentary, Abbot Dorkpa Gyaltsen's commentary. Again, we're using mostly Gyaltsepje's commentary, which I will have a couple of places where we're quoting from tonight, but he describes it here as the ethics of restraint from faulty behavior refers to the 10 abandonments in which one abandons the 10 non-virtues when the motivation is taken into account, and which in terms of entity refers to the ethics that abandon the 7 of body and speech. So again, there are 10 non-virtues, 3 of them are only of the mind, but that's again where everything starts. So in terms of abandoning misbehavior, we want to abandon those of the mind especially, but of course also the 4 of the speech and the 3 of the body. So the 4 of the speech and the 3 of the body are the 7 that are being alluded to here that are essentially when we talk about it in terms of the entity. These are the actual behaviors that we're mostly wanting to refrain from. But we obviously have to also have that restraint in our own minds and not have the mind of covetousness, which is a heightened form of attachment, malice or ill will, which is a heightened form of anger, aversion energy, and then wrong view, which is a form of ignorance. So recall that in our discussion last week, we also talked about how this restraining from faulty behavior also includes to refrain from breaking our vows, recalling that there are 3 sets of vows. The very first are what are called the pratimoksha vows, but they include not just the 5 lay vows that many of you have taken, that we try to abide by on the Buddhist path. Almost everyone who's Buddhist has some exposure to those, but it also includes all of the vows of ordination that many people do decide to take at some point in their Buddhist career. Then beyond pratimoksha vows is the second set, which are the Bodhisattva vows. These are done with the motivation of bodhicitta, and one takes them not just for this life, like the pratimoksha vows, but actually through enlightenment. And they can be studied in advance. There are many resources that you can find that will go into how to hold those vows purely. If you are thinking about taking them, which is very wise to do if you're on this path and wanting to practice more fully, then by all means study them, get to know them, try to live with them, and that way you know what it's like to refrain from the transgressions and the root downfalls and so on. Finally, there's the tantric vows. Tantric vows are given when one takes an empowerment into what's either yoga or highest yoga tantra. Those 2 are the highest that do pertain to kind of more developed practices that one does have to take some vows in order to engage in that. So I can't go into explanations of those. Those are meant to be something that you find out after you've taken the initiation. But they're again, a way to uphold and keep you sort of on the straight path to attaining enlightenment. They're a wonderful gift from the Buddha, these amazing, sets of vows. So this first set also does include that implicitly, though it's not talked about maybe quite as much so directly in the text. In the text, we're mostly going to see it being talked about in terms of avoiding body and speech, misbehavior, what have you. But nonetheless, it would include all of that, the ways that we break our vows and so on. So going into this in terms of the outlines, once more, we do see that training in the morality of restraint, this first of the 3 types of morality, has 2 outlines within it. The very first outline is called purifying the actions of the 3 doors. We're going to see that the second outline is protecting the 3 doors from degeneration. So the 3 doors, once more, are the doors of our body, speech, and mind. Again, the mind is where all of it starts, but obviously a lot of what we think and what goes on in the mind manifests in terms of words we say and physical actions that we engage in. So this has 3 outlines within it. So again, maybe I've got wrong verse numbers up there. Oh, no, this is the first outline, right? It goes through 34 through 44, and then we have the remaining ones in the second outline. Within the first outline, which we're going to go into initially, we've got investigating the actions of body and speech. The other outline within this is the next one is to investigate the actions of our mind. But this has 3 outlines within it in terms of body and speech. First, to investigate the motivation before a physical action. Before we do something with our body or speech, it is important that we check first to see what our motivation is. So this is verse 34. Master Shantideva says, "When at the beginning, having known that such a mind is with fault, at such a time, like a piece of wood, I should remain, being able to rely upon the antidote." So this first verse introduces a concept that we're going to see throughout this section on restraint, kind of being like a log or like a piece of wood. Even one translation had it like a tree. But a tree seems a little more active to me than a piece of wood or a log. A piece of wood or a log, if you had one sitting there in front of you, it wouldn't do anything, right? This is the concept behind this, is that it remains very stable. It's not, swayed in any way. It's not moving. It's unmoving. It has a firmness to it, whereas our minds right now are not like a piece of wood at all. They're constantly moving all over the place and getting into trouble and what have you. So the first thing in terms of our physical behavior is to check what's going on in our mind. And if we know that the mind's at fault, having the wrong motivation, having the wrong intention, then we should remain like a piece of wood. being able to rely upon, the antidotes. The antidotes we're going to talk about a little bit later, but they are essentially all the virtuous minds that help keep us in a place where we don't have the practice of non-virtue, where we avoid these faults. So it's kind of interesting. This is in the little handout that you have. Again, there's a whole bunch of talking about this because Abbot Drukpa Gyaltsen in his commentary goes actually into the 8 worldly concerns. I'm going to talk about them briefly. I'm going to share all of what's in your handout, but most of you know this topic of the 8 worldly concerns or the 8 worldly dharmas. These are indicative of when our mind is having a mundane motivation, when we are involved in attachment, when we are involved in an unhealthy state. So these are the things that we're trying to watch out for in that previous slide. When Master Shantideva says that the mind is with fault, well, Abbot Drukpa Gyaltsen says, well, how do we know the mind's at fault? We'll check and see if any of these 8 worldly concerns is arising. So in that handout, I have a quote from Pabanka Rinpoche, his text on the Lam Rim called Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand. He says, Geshe Potawa said, you cannot sew with a pronged, two-pointed needle. If you do not think about death, you will not ignore this life. If you do not ignore this life, you will be influenced by the 8 worldly concerns. So this is actually speaking to where this topic is generally talked about in the Lam Rim. It's usually talked about in the context of remembering death and impermanence. But it's brought up here because obviously this is something we want to avoid throughout our spiritual career as much as possible, is to not have even our Dharma practice motivated by these 8 worldly concerns, much less our mundane actions get involved in the worldly concerns. So these are the 8 worldly concerns being spelled out by Pabanka Rinpoche. Again, most of you know these. Being happy if you receive gifts is the first one. Being unhappy if you do not. And of course, it's the attachment to these that is the problem. We're going to be happy if we receive things and unhappy if we do not, but how attached are we to those concepts? The third and fourth are being happy if comfortable and unhappy if not. The fifth and sixth are being happy if famous and unhappy if not. The seventh and eighth are happy if we're praised and unhappy if we're criticized. So obviously we see our mind going all over the place. And just having the unpleasant experience of being criticized, for example, is one element of it. But having the strong attachment to the view of ourselves as being only deserving of praise is what causes being criticized to be problematic. And our attachment to our view of ourselves and the pride we have is what of course causes us to be happy when we're praised. We should be hearing whatever it is, praise, criticism, being famous, not being famous, whatever the case might be, experiencing those without our mind going all over the place. So Nagarjuna said of these 8, this is actually in his letter to a friend, I believe. He says, by the 8 worldly concerns, we mean the worldly thoughts from receiving gifts or no gifts, or having things taken away from us, even loss, comfort or discomfort, fame or notoriety, praise or criticism. Keep a level head. These are not subjects for your thoughts. We can get quite involved in, being totally captivated by these things in our lives. Venerable Rabina, I think I can share this. I think she shared it in a public setting where she said that the one that is most challenging for her is comfort, right? We're really attached to being comfortable. We don't like discomfort. That's why I think what's going on in the world right now around COVID-19 is so challenging for people, is because they want to be comfortable. They want to have things the way they like them. They want to be able to go to their favorite restaurants. They want to be able to go out to the movies. They want all of these things that make them comfortable, that make them feel good. And we get quite attached to pleasure and to wanting those pleasurable experiences. And when we're not getting them enough, then we start getting irritable, right? Because what happens when attachment doesn't get what it wants is that the mind gets angry and upset. So these two kind of vacillating points that we go back and forth between, getting the pleasure and then getting quite attached to it. And then when we don't get the pleasure, we get the displeasure, the unpleasant feelings, and then we get quite averse to that and we want to get rid of all of that. And people can spend their entire lives captivated by this way of relating to what's going on. Their experiences are totally dictated by that. So we want to watch that because it causes us to waste this life. But moreover, it causes us to generally engage in non-virtue. So going to Geshe Loden's Lam Rim text, a more contemporary Lam Rim text, he says, for your Dharma practice to be pure, it is necessary to have abandoned the comforts of this life. Again, we mean having abandoned the attachment to the comforts of this life. and making that our sole goal is just to have the most comfortable life in the world, to be totally cushy, to not have to experience any bit of harm whatsoever. So he says that is to have renounced the 8 worldly dharmas. The 8 worldly dharmas, once more, in his words, being pleased when receiving wealth, being displeased when losing wealth, being pleased when experiencing pleasure or comfort again, being displeased when experiencing misery, being pleased at being famous, displeased at being in disrepute, pleased when praised, displeased when denigrated. So this is just to, again, go over those in a number of different words so that we are quite clear on the concept there. To practice purely, Geshe Loden says, we must renounce these 8 worldly dharmas so that we do not become excited at having wealth, pleasure, fame, and praise, or depressed by loss, misery, disrepute, or criticism. By retaining equanimity towards these, your mind becomes clear of the anxieties and frustrations of this life, and you are able to focus purely on Dharma practice. So this is the import of all of this, is that this is how we keep our mind, what Shantideva is saying in the verse that started this discussion, was that we need to make sure the mind isn't together with any faults. Well, most of the faults are going to arise when we are attached to the pleasures of this life and attached to avoiding the displeasures of this life and so on. If we get totally caught up in the mundane, the worldly concerns, then our Dharma practice goes right out the window, because everything becomes about getting what I want on the basis of these deluded states of mind. So if we are able to be free of them, to not be so concerned about them, and it doesn't mean that you won't experience them. You're still going to experience comfort and discomfort and, praise and blame and all of the other things, criticism. All of these are going to come about, but you're not going to be all over the place. You're going to keep focusing purely on Dharma practice. So, whoops, let me get the screen back up here. Somehow I got out of it. So that's kind of that verse. So let me go ahead and take it off share, because that was the end of the discussion of the 8 worldly concerns. Let me read what is said in Gyaltsep Je's commentary very quickly. He says, before engaging into any physical action, such as walking or talking, so he includes speaking in a physical action, because obviously it is a physical part of our being. Sometimes we divide those and say physical and verbal actions, but in this context, we're putting both body and speech together in a physical action. So he says, before doing that, investigate this mind of yours to see whether the motivation for the action is flawed or not. Again, if it's together with these 8 worldly concerns or not. In case a flawed motivation has arisen, then, while remembering the antidote against the afflictions, remain like a piece of wood. Yeah. Do not be moved by the motivation. Do not move in the direction of this faulty motivation. If we find at some point we really check in and we go, again, through the force of our introspection, we kind of go, what's going on here? Why am I engaging in this particular interchange with somebody? Is it motivated by my attachment to get something from them? Is it motivated by some aversion I have towards something else? If I'm finding that those are the motivations behind it, then I have to apply something that's antidotal. I have to bring to mind my faith in the Dharma and all the other things we're going to look at later. But there are even, again, specific antidotes to some of the delusions that I've gone into in the past. But we also want to have antidotal virtuous states of mind that block the non-virtue from arising. In this whole section, we're talking about refraining from non-virtue. Well, most of that is done through the force of virtuous states of mind. Here, this idea of being like a piece of wood almost makes it sound like we're not doing anything. And there can be some element of that to it, which can be useful, right? Venerable Rabina, again, I'm quoting her a lot. She's going to start her teachings with Thupten Norberling tomorrow, which I'm quite excited about. We'll have a week of teachings with her. But anyway, she always says that she learned when she was a little girl, this little phrase that is essentially how we practice this is, zip your lip and keep your hands to yourself. If we actually refrain from saying things, at that time we remain like a piece of wood and we just zip our lip, or we keep our hands to ourselves. We just don't get into being physically messing with other people, messing with their possessions, messing with them. So these are the ways that we're talking about kind of being like a piece of wood, is being in that space where we're not moved to do anything. But it should be a deeper practice than that. It's not just, oh, I'm just going to be here like with a blank look on my face like a deer in the headlights and not do anything. We're cultivating some virtuous states of mind that keep even the mental patterns from arising. Recall that once more, we perfect our ethics not by, we saw that earlier in the verses in chapter 5, right? That we were looking at about how all the perfection emotions are perfected within our minds. It's mostly about perfecting the state of mind that is not wanting to harm others and only wanting to abide in virtue. So this is, again, the thoughts have to accompany it. It's not just like I'm going to stay like a piece of wood and just blank out and not do anything. That can be a part of the practice initially, but we have to actually cultivate virtue in the face of that. The second outline after this, investigating the motivation before we act verbally or physically, is to give us some advice about looking. And this is kind of an interesting little section, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It seems to be directed a lot at monastics, but again, this is who Master Shantideva was teaching when he first set out this text, was an audience of monks that he was giving advice about how to go about living in the world and so on. This has 4 outlines. The very first is the general way of looking, verse 35. Master Shantideva says, "Never should I look around distractedly for no purpose. With a resolute mind, I should always keep my eyes cast downwards." Of course, for most of us, if this is how we go about, maybe people are doing this now with what's going on with the pandemic, is people are, not having much distraction around them. They're going out, if they go out at all, to get groceries, to get exactly what they need and get the heck out of the store and get home or something. And so they're keeping their eyes cast downwards, not maybe making contacts as much with other people. We want to make sure that we do this with the right mindset. This isn't meaning that we're trying to avoid people entirely. We'll see this coming up in one of the sections within this. But the whole purpose of not getting distracted is so that our mind doesn't get caught up in all of the sense objects, all the things that can trigger things for us, that can cause the delusions to arise, that can cause our attachment to the 8 worldly concerns to arise, and so on. So Gyaltsab says, "I shall never allow myself to be distracted and look around meaninglessly, because this causes the mind to degenerate. And in a sense, for us to be distracted by the 5 sense objects, beautiful sights, wonderful sounds, delicious smells and tastes, as well as, tangible objects, things that might entice us in that way. We can also have those certainly in our thoughts. We don't need to have the external physical objects for them to become distractions for us. But the whole point here right now in this section is about the actions of body and speech and how we refrain from getting involved in things that could be harmful. This is how we control our body to some degree so that we keep the eyes cast downwards. We don't get so caught up in looking all around for something to distract us, some shiny object to entice us. So then Gyaltsab says, "With the virtuous object firmly in mind, I shall always look with my eyes cast down." It says one niching in front of me. It's about a meter in front of you or so. Again, this is maybe possible to some degree to walk around, but I don't think in New York City on a typical day, not what we're dealing with now, that you'd want to just have your eyes cast downward. You want to be keeping your eyes up so you're not, falling over or running into somebody or whatever the case might be. But again, this is just a guarding our mind thing, which is, again, the topic that we're really looking at in this whole chapter. The second outline within this advice about looking is how to look when we're tired. So here, these 2 lines from verse 36, Shantideva says, "But in order to relax the gaze for a short while, I should look around." And Gyaltsab says simply, when one is looking for a resting place when tired, then one can occasionally lift one's gaze and look around. So it's not to say that we should have this kind of totally resolute thing about looking down in front of us and never looking up, never diverting from that at all. I mean, relax the gaze occasionally, look around, kind of check out where you are, take in what's around you. I mean, I think for the Bodhisattva in particular, it is important that we stay aware of what's going on in terms of other beings, because as we're going to see, the advice will even come that we should make sure that we don't avoid or miss an opportunity to help other beings or to be attentive to them. So when we are tired of doing that practice, that intensive practice of just keeping the gaze downward, not getting so involved in things that will distract, we should relax that at times. Third outline, how to act when another person comes close. So here, Master Shantideva says, if someone appears in my field of vision, I should look at him or her and say, "It's good that you have come." I mean, greet other people warmly. Think that it's good that we've seen them, that we are acknowledging them. And to check if there is any danger on the path and so forth, I should look again and again in the 4 directions, everywhere, just to make sure that I am, not getting caught up in anything that would be dangerous for myself or for others. So it's kind of interesting. No Time to Lose, Pema Chodron says that this essentially means just being awake means acting appropriately. So we don't kind of be aloof and totally uninvolved with other people. So when we see people, we respond appropriately. We don't, just kind of go, oh, I'm sorry, I'm practicing my mindfulness of where I am and not getting distracted, so I'm not even going to acknowledge you. Instead, we want to make sure that we do what we can to greet other people. And then, of course, be aware, as Gyaltsab Je says, also while walking along a path, one needs to repeatedly look around in the four directions to check whether there are any dangers or not, whether there is anything we need to be attending to. So again, this is just, I mean, it's a bit of this is like Miss Manners or something. It's just how we are wanting to be in the world, but keeping in mind that, again, we don't want to get too distracted and too caught up in worldly concerns as we go about our business every day. The fourth outline is how to act when one rests. These are another 4 lines from these 2 verses. Shantideva says, to rest, I should turn my head around and then look behind me. Having examined both the head and behind, I should proceed to either come or go. So Gyaltsab Je says, further, having rested and setting out again, direct your attention outwards and look also behind your back for your possessions, and so on. Having checked whether in front or behind there are any cliffs and so forth, one either continues along one's path or goes back as is appropriate. So again, I don't think we need to take it totally literally, but this is just encouraging us to have a healthy mindfulness, a healthy awareness, to be present with where we are. To not just space out, but rather to acknowledge what we have in front of us, what we have behind us, and then make our decisions on the basis of what it is that we are intending to do. If we're on our way to the Gompa to engage in a class, then we don't get too distracted and running into a bookstore to buy something. Of course, I'm talking here in ordinary pre-pandemic terms, but the idea is that we have to have this sort of awareness when we are out and about doing what is beneficial at all times. As Pema Chodron says, acting appropriately. Now going on to the third outline. Again, the second was the advice about looking. Now we're relating it to other actions, kind of relating our way of being physically and so on. So Master Shantideva says in these last 2 lines, being aware of the necessity, I should act like this in all situations. So how this is explained is by Gyaltsab Je. He says, having understood the need for the benefit of self and others, act like this with all your physical and verbal actions. So again, keeping in mind that the underlying motivation behind all of this is bodhicitta, is our desire to benefit others, to become enlightened for their sake. So we don't want to, again, get totally caught up in things that will cause our mind to get unruly and go out of control, and of course our behavior to follow. But nor do we also want to be totally negligent of the beings around us. We want to act appropriately. So in the Precious Garland, again, the commentary by Abbot Dr. Gyaltsen, he says, and maybe I even have this on the slide. Let me check. I may have that. I'm not sure if I put this in or not. No, I didn't. Okay, then let me go ahead and just share it from my text here. It says thus, being aware of the necessity to benefit others in all situations of engaging in activities of body and speech, I shall enact activities belonging to the class of virtue. Of course, we're in the section about avoiding non-virtue, but you can't help but talk about avoiding non-virtue and virtue, because just the avoidance of non-virtue can become very virtuous. I mean, right now we are, all of us, avoiding the non-virtue of killing at this time, unless there's ants on your desk and you're smashing them or something, which I hope you aren't. But we're not engaging in killing, so we can say we're avoiding killing, but we don't have a strong virtuous mind behind that. Unless you've taken the vow not to kill, you're not getting the virtue of not killing just because there are no beings around you that you are tempted to kill. But most of the time when we're trying to avoid non-virtue, we are trying to cultivate a more virtuous state of mind. So when we see an insect or a bug that we might normally kill, to have the thought, oh, this is a suffering sentient being, I need to protect its life. It's precious, and it's who that being is, and my desire to benefit that being, it's wrong for me to take the life of that being or to harm it. Well, that's the virtuous thought that accompanies the act of refraining from killing. So again, we're going to see that coming in here, where virtue is talked about a lot, even though we're in the first of the 3 types of morality that's about refraining from non-virtue. So again, let's go on then to the next section. We'll do quite a few more verses hopefully tonight, and I'll stop in about 15 minutes before we conclude to see if there are any questions or comments. So hold on to them or put them in the chat box if you think you might forget them. The fourth outline, this final outline in this section that has to do with investigating the actions of body and speech. So this is in investigating the action of remaining. So, Master Shantideva says in verse 39, having prepared for an action with the thought, my body will remain in such a way, then periodically I should look to see how is the body abiding. So the previous sections we were looking at that idea of, again, what is the motivation behind my actions and so on. So and how am I kind of preparing myself to be out in the world? So having prepared for the actions we're going to engage in, with the thought of my body and my speech, we can include speech again in this context, will remain in such a way I'm going to abide in that path of refraining from non-virtue and so on. Then periodically I should look to see, how is my body abiding? How is my speech doing? We need to once more have that kind of introspection, that guarding alertness that checks up to see what the quality of our physical and verbal actions actually are. So there's not much commentary from Gyaltsab Je on this. I'm on page 23 of Gyaltsab Je's text. Sorry, I haven't been giving the page numbers recently tonight yet. He says, after having had the thought, I shall remain in this position, stop the actions of the body and place it for the time being in the planned position, in where we want to actually abide, how we want to be in the world, and so on. Look in the explained way and act always without faults. So that concludes that section. That's, again, mostly about kind of how we work with the two doors of our body and speech. Now we go on to look at how we work with investigating the mind. I think I hit two. Oh, I missed a slide here in terms of showing the next outline is investigating the mind. The first one was, again, investigating the actions of body and speech. It has within it a number of outlines. Let's see, it's got two outlines, just two. So the first one is fastening the mind to the virtuous object, and this is verse 40. With utmost effort, I should check to see that the crazed elephant of my mind is not wandering off, but is bound to the great pillar of thinking about the Dharma. So you should be kind of remembering that this is very close to a verse that we saw earlier, right? And when we talked about the crazed elephant of the mind, way back towards the beginning of this, I didn't actually pull it forward and put another slide in for it, but this goes back to the elephant is mentioned back in verse 2, letting the elephant mind wander, and so on, this unsubdued, crazy elephant mind. So here the idea is that with the most effort we can make, we should always check to see that this crazed elephant of our minds isn't wandering off, isn't going off, getting distracted by the attachment, the pleasures that we're seeking and so on, getting caught up in aversion and anger towards the unpleasant things, but rather it's bound, it's tied with the rope of mindfulness to the great pillar of thinking about the Dharma. So our thoughts should always be together with Dharma as much as possible. Of course, once more, this is dependent to the degree that we have become familiar with Dharma through our study. Recall that, again, there are three levels of wisdom. We've touched on these before. The very first wisdom is what we accumulate by hearing the Dharma, by reading the Dharma. Right now, we're all engaged in accumulating wisdom to some degree just by hearing these words, by looking at Shantideva's text. But then we have the wisdom that arises through thinking. And for most of us now, that is our analytical meditation. That's when we spend time, and I'm, again, encouraging all of you as much as possible to reflect on the verses that we cover each week, to go back and sit in meditation and read them over, look at the commentaries that you might have, Gyaltsab Je's and so on, and reflect on their meaning, so that you then have them more in your mind. And then eventually you develop the third level of wisdom, the wisdom that arises from deeper meditation, not just thinking and reflecting in what we call our meditation, but through having developed a deep concentration, the ability to change the fabric of our minds, to actually experience the Dharma at a much deeper level. So again, this is the idea of how we actually are able to change our minds and have this happen continually is for our minds to be in the Dharma is by actually spending time cultivating those three wisdoms through our study, through our reflection, through our meditation, to be able to keep our minds in Dharma, to have our mind like that crazed elephant tied to the pillar of Dharma so that we never have it wandering from that. So Gyaltsab here just says, after having, he says, check with all your effort that the unsubdued and crazy elephant mind does not lose the great pillar of the Dharma object, that one accepted to contemplate single-pointedly the way one fastened the mind to it. So we've got this Dharma object that we've accepted to contemplate on single-pointedly that we really want to keep our minds in, especially the Mahayana Dharma, the wish to benefit others, to be of service to them, and so on. So we've got to keep our mind fastened to that as much as possible. That's again what this whole chapter is about, is guarding the mind, keeping the mind from going down the pathway of bad ethical behavior, first by avoiding the non-virtues, the non-virtuous thoughts. Keeping the mind in Dharma will naturally cause those not to arise. If when we meet another being, we're going to get into in chapter 6, of course, all the wonderful teachings of Master Shantideva on cultivating patience and not becoming angry. But the idea is that if we meet somebody who criticizes us, who scorns us, who says something really negative to us, because our mind is fastened to the idea of wanting to benefit that being, we see it's totally inappropriate to say something negative back to them, do anything that would harm them, because we want to benefit them. So this is how, again, we're talking about investigating the mind, looking at the mind and seeing how we need to keep our mind tied to the thoughts that will help us to avoid non-virtue. So the second outline within this, investigating the mind, is to analyze whether the mind is single-pointedly focused on virtue or not. So we again had that idea of initially wanting to tie our minds to virtue. Now we look at this verse 41 that essentially tells us, is the mind in that state? I who strive by all means for meditative stabilization should not wander off even for a moment, thinking, what is this mind of mine doing? I should investigate my mind. So once more, these are these kind of two tools of mindfulness and introspection or guarding alertness that we need, and we develop them through our meditative concentration, through sitting on our cushion and doing meditation, focusing single-pointedly on the breath or other objects. This is how we cultivate those very strongly. But you don't just do it so you have them in meditation. You do that so that you can have them while you're out and about and in the world. So we can then be aware of, what is my mind doing right now? Is my mind heading off in non-virtuous thoughts, thinking negative thoughts about people that I'm seeing from a distance that are doing things? Is it getting attached to beautiful, attractive people that I see that, that's arising for me? What is my mind actually about at this point? So the previous verse was about tying it to the Dharma, keeping that mindfulness of the Dharma, but then we need that introspection, that sort of checking in to say, what am I doing right now? I need to investigate my mind continually. Then we go on to the next outline that comes up within this. This is, again, the third outline within purifying the actions of the three doors. These are the last three verses of this section that have to do with Master Shantideva giving us some additional advice that is unique to the Bodhisattva path, explaining the permitted and the forbidden actions, where we do have permission at times to perhaps engage in what might be a non-virtue, because we are trying to practice something else that comes before that, that is more important at that time to hold. So we're going to see kind of an interesting little section here about what are the exceptions to maintaining absolute pure morality. So in verse 42, Master Shantideva says, but if I am unable to do this when involved in fear, when my life is at stake and so on, or celebrations when I'm with other people and trying to be with them and enjoy the time with them and so on, and the like, where I'm making those connections to others, then I should relax. I shouldn't be like so hung up on making sure that I'm abiding by absolute pure morality, because I've become problematic to my connections to others, or to my even being able to avert danger in my own life. The last two lines, thus it has been taught that at times of giving, for example, you may be indifferent to ethics. So this is an important thing to spend a little bit of time on, in terms of what is said in Gyaltsab's text, but also what is being alluded to here. Because essentially when we look at the 6 perfections that I just went through, the very first one, again, is giving, is generosity. And these are said to be a bit of a hierarchy. We start with the easiest one to practice, a generosity, and we work our way up. So we can say that morality is a more important practice because it does come after generosity. But when we are at that stage where we're simply practicing the first perfection, we're practicing generosity, then that may take precedence over morality. And there are some exceptions that are spelled out by some of our teachers that I did want to share, but let's go through what Gyaltsab says on this part. It's not divided up as much. This is page 24. Verse 42 is on 23, and then we have 43 and 44, and the entire commentary is put together. But essentially, the first part of this has to do with verse 42. Gyaltsab says, if one is unable to perform certain extremely subtle actions of body and mind at the time of, first, danger to one's life, if we are being endangered, the Bodhisattva path, at some stage, yes, we may feel fine about sacrificing our life to benefit others and so on, really high ideal concepts that we don't have currently. But most of the time, we do have to be attentive to our own welfare and our own security and make sure that we are taken care of, that we can continue to live this life, to develop our minds and so on. We do it with good motivation. We don't do it because of attachment to this life and to our body. But nonetheless, those are times when perhaps we do have to be sacrificing some of our practice of morality. Making offerings to the triple gem with prayers, actions for the superior purpose of others, and so on. When we're engaging in things that are a benefit to others, maybe we do have to bend the laws a little bit, not do complete absolute adherence to virtue and avoidance of non-virtue. So from the sutta requested by Inexhaustible Wisdom, the Buddha said, thus, at the time of generosity, contain morality and practice equanimity. So the commentary from Gyaltsab explains that, saying, this is saying that at a time when one is not able to practice both generosity and morality simultaneously, and it is the time for mainly practicing generosity, then one should practice equanimity and leave one's subtle practice of morality. So an equanimous mind will then know what is the right, proper thing to do, abide in the state of practicing generosity purely, and not worry so much about the engagement in morality. The purpose, he says, is to be skillful in accomplishing the path sequentially. The path is set out in terms of just like the Lam Rim, right? We have the beginning stages of the Lam Rim that are important to train in, the person of small capacity. Then we have the middle level, and it's important that we engage in this fully before we engage in that. And then we have the great level, and it's important that we do the middle before we do the great, and so on. It's the same with the perfections. It is good to make sure that we have a good familiarity with the practice of generosity before we go on to adhere strongly to morality. Ideally, yes, practice all 6 perfections, but know that there will be times when we're practicing generosity. We need to perhaps not be as caught up and tight about our practice of morality. So let's look at the examples that are set out. First, in Abbot Drukpa Gyaltsen's text, this is his commentary on this section. He says, the teachings of Akshayamati Sutra says, thus at the time of giving, withdraw ethics and act indifferently, teaching that at times of giving, when you are unable to perform both simultaneously, and giving is your main training, you may be indifferent to the inability to accomplish subtle ethics. Again, subtle ethics is, I don't know how it would be quite to be defined in here, but any sort of practice of our ethics we want to do, we may have times when we have to sacrifice that if we're engaging in giving, for example. So he says this means that you must complete the training sequentially by being skilled in the order of the path. So this is just, again, different words for some of the same thoughts that I just read from Gyaltsab. But then Geshe Yeshe Topten, in one of the books, again, it's got a different title. This was the title of it when it was first published, The Way of Awakening. I think it's something about Bodhisattva behavior or something. I can't remember the name of the text now that it's been republished by Wisdom. But he says, a monk is forbidden to touch a woman, for example, because of his vows. But if the woman is drowning, he must save her. This is a form of generosity. Again, that we have that generosity. One of the types of generosity is protecting others from harm. If we are in a position where, say, this is a monk who has taken the vow not to touch a woman, this is breaking vows. Monks, of course, don't have sexual contact with anyone, but to touch a woman is, not allowed in general in terms of ethical behavior. It's part of one's pratimoksha vows if one is a monk. So in the case where the person is drowning, a woman is drowning, well, then he's going to throw that one out the window because it's more important that he practice the generosity of protecting from harm. So Geshe Topten says, it is as if he were offering his life to this woman, and while he is doing this, he can relax the practice of moral discipline. In fact, if there were, other monks watching, because he's running into the river to save a drowning woman and grabbing her body, taking her to the shore to save her from that, even giving her CPR and whatever, so that he can benefit her, the monks would be remiss to accuse this monk of breaking his vows by doing this, because the practice of generosity takes precedence in a situation like that. Then Geshe Topten says, at times when involved in a virtuous action, it is not possible to apply both types of practice at the same time, both morality and generosity. So we commit ourselves to the practice with more affinity to the action we have decided to perform. And of course, at the time when the monk is witnessing a woman drowning in the river, the important practice to commit oneself to, that one is decided to perform, is to practice the generosity of saving that woman from drowning, from losing her life. In the particular case of the drowning woman and the monk who saves her, since there is no time to think about whether to observe the discipline of morality, the practitioner must act first and resume the interrupted practice later. Of course, it doesn't mean that he's now got carte blanche and can touch women however he wants because he touched a woman to save her from the waters. It means that he goes back to practicing that morality as purely as possible, and only in these exceptional cases would one avoid that, or not engage in that particular behavior. So one other type of behavior, which I think I even talked about earlier, His Holiness talks about that in this section, and I mentioned it earlier about lying, and sometimes how, lying, of course, being one of the 10 non-virtues, we don't want to engage in that unless we absolutely have to. And there will be situations where maybe we do have to, and His Holiness uses that example, you might recall it, where the deer goes bounding through the woods. I think Geshe Jampa Tekchog, in a commentary I have of his on this text, he used the example of like a person running through the woods, and then suddenly coming after are a bunch of hunters looking for the person or the deer and saying, did you see this person run through there? Well, he says you should maybe say something nonsensical at that time, that, you should say something like, it is good to uphold virtue, or something. Like with the person asks you a question, don't answer them with a lie if you don't have to. But if the person keeps pressing you and wants you to say, have you seen them or haven't you? In order to protect the life of that deer or that person that's being chased by these people, you can say, no, I haven't seen them, or lie about where they went or what have you. So at those special times when you're trying to practice the generosity of protecting from harm the deer or the person who's being, this is kind of a strange scenario. If it's a criminal who's being chased by police, maybe it's a little bit different, but in that case you might have to rethink what you're doing. But in the case of just somebody their life is at risk, and you can see that there are other people that would be endangering them, maybe it is good to hide them, to do what you can to protect them. And even if you have to lie at those times because you're taking precedence with regard to your practice of generosity, protecting the other being from harm, then that's what is important to engage in. So again, this is just explaining this last section, how we do have particular situations where we have to have some attention to engaging in perhaps breaking our code of morality to some degree in order to practice something that is more important at that time. So then continuing in this section, verse 43, Master Shantideva says, I should undertake whatever deed I have intended to do and think of doing nothing other than that. With my mind focused upon that, I should set about for the time being to accomplish it. So it's kind of just giving this good advice about, one needing to continue to practice what one has determined to practice. In the case of this example, the generosity that one wants to continue to develop and to fine tune, and perhaps again, let go of the practice of morality, but be dedicated, focused upon achieving an exceeding practice of generosity. So the question comes up in verse 20, or on page 24 of Master Shantideva's text. Actually, maybe let's go through verse 44 and then I'll cover this commentary. Shantideva says then, by acting in this way, all will be done well, whereas neither will be done well if we continue to vacillate between these two. We don't practice generosity completely to where we've perfected that, nor do we practice our morality perfectly. We kind of keep going back and forth and damaging one for the sake of the other. But if we practice generosity well, then we have a foundation for our practice of morality to continue. And he says, thus there will be no increase in the secondary affliction of non-introspection. This one I'll go into a little bit more when we get to it. So in Gyaltsep Je's commentary on page 24, addressing that first verse 43 and the first part of 44, he says, there's a query, a question. Someone says, how can one regard it with equanimity since morality is greater than generosity? Just spelling out what I said earlier, that essentially someone could look at it and say, but morality is a more important practice. Well, yes, it is. It's greater than the practice of generosity. But you have to have, again, a sequential way of working through these. So the answer given is one does not divert mentally from the first practice in a series that have to be practiced sequentially. Generosity, which has to be practiced first, is practiced alone with a firm mind for the time being. This is to achieve the proper sequence of the path, because if one mistakes the sequence, then one will not achieve the former or the latter. So again, recognizing that the six perfections are set out in terms of this sequential idea. I just said a few minutes earlier, though, and it is important that we do our best to practice all six as best as we can. But recognize that if we're not at the point where we've really developed to a great degree our generosity, then that's the default practice we should always be going to, is how do I practice generosity as best as I can? And if we do have situations where perhaps we have to let go of our behavior and maintaining an avoidance of the virtuous actions in order to accomplish generosity, that we actually stay true to generosity. Then going on to this last little bit about non-introspection, Gyaltsep Je says, by knowing and following the stages of the path, going through the sequential development of our minds, the secondary afflictions, such as non-introspection, and which do not know the sequence, all of any afflictions we have in regard to not knowing the way that we should be proceeding on the path will not increase. We won't have any problems with that. So this is where this whole topic of non-introspection is brought up. Non-introspection, you might recall last week I talked about shame and embarrassment, which were two of the virtuous states of mind and the mental factors. Non-introspection is one of the non-virtuous, well, it's called actually a secondary affliction. That's why it says on this verse, the secondary affliction of non-introspection. It won't increase if we actually attend to the sequence of the path and practice things accordingly and develop our minds in this very graded way, gradual way. So I thought it would be helpful just to introduce you to the non-introspection as it is talked about in the text that is used when we study the mental factors. I alluded to this previously. It's called Lorik, is the name of the full text, means minds and awarenesses. And essentially it includes all the main minds of the five sense consciousnesses and our mental consciousness. And it includes 51 mental factors as a tool to investigate the various components of our mind. And they're divided into 6 groups. One of those groups is the secondary afflictions, and non-introspection is among those 20 secondary afflictions. So regarding non-introspection, the Compendium of Knowledge, which is the text by Arya Sangha, says, question, what is non-introspection? The response, a wisdom that is concomitant with afflictions and engages unknowingly in activities of body, speech, and mind. It has the function of acting as a support for infractions. So again, this is the nature of that mind, is that it comes together with, it arises with, it's concomitant with the afflictions. And it engages unknowingly. It keeps us from having knowledge. It's called a wisdom because it is an aspect of our mind that is discerning something. But our wisdom can be afflicted. It's not to say that all wisdom is not a virtuous state of mind necessarily. It has to be accompanied with virtuous thoughts for it to be virtuous. Wisdom is simply knowing something. But here it's engaging in an unknowing way of not being kind of aware of what we're doing with our body, speech, and mind. It's not actually having the awareness that it's supposed to have in regard to those. So it's not having present the introspection that is checking up. So it's included within the whole category of introspection because it's a wisdom like introspection, but it's a wisdom that is not aware of what's going on. It sounds strange to call it that, but it has the function to be a support for all of our infractions, all of our misbehavior. So just as it has been said above, this is continuing with that commentary on this mental factor. It is an afflicted wisdom that engages unknowingly in activities of the 3 doors. It's not being aware of what we're doing with our 3 doors, with our body, speech, and mind. It is the discordant class of introspection. The whole topic of this chapter, right? This ability to have this guarding alertness, to know what's going on in our minds, to know what's happening in our body and our speech. That this non-introspection acts as a support for infractions accords with what is said in engaging in the Bodhisattva deeds, the text we're studying, in verse 526, which I repeated here on the screen for you to just go back to look at that. Even those who have plenty of hearing, faith, and a diligent endeavor will become sullied by a downfall due to the fault of lacking introspection. So this whole concept is being driven home here that if we go back to the verse that this started with, by acting in this way, all will be done well, otherwise neither will be done. There will thus be no increase in the secondary affliction of non-introspection. We won't have any increase in that blindness, that unknowingness with regard to what's happening physically, verbally, mentally, if we attend to the path in the proper way, if we actually know what it is that we're setting out to do and continue to be diligent in paying attention to that. So this is the idea behind this, is kind of to emphasize the importance of non-introspection, or the importance of introspection in combating our non-introspection. Let's go ahead with a few more minutes before we take a small break and see where everyone's at and if there are any questions. We're, again, in this outline of training in the morality of restraint. We saw that, again, this had the two outlines. I'm not sure why I repeated that. The second outline is because we were going into the second outline now. Remember that the first outline was purifying the actions of the three doors. Now we have the second outline, which is the remainder of the verses for this morality of restraint. Protecting the three doors from degeneration. What are the kind of active things that we do? Purifying meant more kind of how do we make sure that as we go about acting physically, verbally, and of course mentally, what are the sorts of things that we want to purify, that we want to make sure are in line so that we act accordingly. Now is when we are looking at how we are behaving when we are in actual situations. How do we protect the three doors from degenerating from the state that we've set them in? This has two outlines. The first is protecting the training of the body from degeneration. And as we saw earlier, that includes our speech. Anything we're doing with the body that includes speech is important that we have, some protection of that training so that it doesn't degenerate. This has three outlines within it. The first is not letting the body fall under the control of distraction. Of course, because we have these five senses in our bodies, we can get distracted very, very easily. Verse 45 says then, if I engage in a variety of senseless talk or in many kinds of spectacular shows, I should abandon attachment towards them. Of course, this is what we often have going on, is that we get quite caught up with others and doing things, meaningless speech, which again is one of the 10 non-virtues as well, and even other forms of harmful speech, or we have spectacular shows, which can be any of the things that entice us in regard to our senses that we then kind of get led to like a moth to a flame, and we just don't have that mind that is really paying attention at that time, not protecting our body and our speech from these behaviors. So the advice being given by Shantideva is to abandon the attachment towards these things. Here, Gyaltsab Je says, do not engage in meaningless talk, such as gossip about kings or robbers, and also do not engage in dance or one of the many other kinds of spectacular performances. If there is a purpose, or if it is to harmonize with someone, then one should abandon attachment for the action. So it's not to say, once more, going back to what Pema Chodron says, it's acting appropriately. If we're in a situation where everybody's having a party, I remember hearing over at the Institute how when Lama Yeshe was there for one Christmas, how he did a little Dharma talk for like the Christmas Eve celebration. And then he wanted people to put on music and dance and have a good time. But you do it without attachment as best as you can, recognizing that it's just a way of being with others, having a joyous experience, but not getting so attached to it, not letting that mind arise. So we once more, not let our bodies and our speech fall under the control of these distractions, of the delusions. When we are with others and enjoying a time with them that's good, that's nice, delicious food, what have you, that we don't have a mind that's getting totally attached to it and thereby getting caught up in it and strengthening all the patterns that we're trying to break. The second outline is to abandon meaningless activities. Doing things that, might have some purpose in our mundane world, but are really pretty meaningless and might even be harmful. Here in verse 46, Shantideva says, if for no reason I dig the earth, cut grass, draw patterns in the earth, and the like, then recalling the advice of the Sugatas, I should immediately stop out of fear. So certainly those who are ordained, such as monks and nuns, I'm pretty sure nuns, fully ordained nuns have this vow as well, that they're not supposed to dig in the earth or trim branches of trees and so on. And why that's so is because there are beings that live in the earth and there are beings that live in the trees, and they might be harming them by virtue of those mundane behaviors. Now again, some of us may decide we want to grow a vegetable garden and we won't need to dig the earth to do that. Try to do things as mindfully as possible. But if we do see that it's going to lead down the path of causing harm to other beings, then we want to refrain from that as best as we can. So here, Gyaltsab gives a little bit of commentary. He says, even if one is not a bhikkhu, not a fully ordained monk, when one is engaged in meaningless activities such as digging, cutting grass, drawing in the dirt, and so forth, then one should remember the trainings of the Tathagata, of the Buddha, and being afraid of the shortcomings of one's actions, stop them right there. So again, I don't know that we need to take everything absolutely literally, but watch the degree to which we get caught up in mundane things. Make sure we protect our body and our speech from doing things that are not going to be so meaningful. And if we do those things, then they're mundane activities. Once more, recall that Lama Zopa Rinpoche gives incredible advice that I think he found from in a sutra of the Buddha about how we do what's called bodhicitta mindfulness, do our activities with with the bodhisattva ethic, with the bodhisattva mentality. So for example, he encourages people when you do retreat with him at the Light of the Path retreats, which unfortunately they've had to cancel this year's. Hopefully it'll happen next year. But at these retreats, he encourages people to practice bodhicitta mindfulness all day, so that when they go to the room and they turn on the light switch, they think that they're enlightening all beings by virtue of turning on the light in the room. Or when they close a door, you think you're closing the door to the lower realms for all beings. You accompany all your mundane actions with virtuous thoughts. Then you transform them into virtue, because it's mostly what we're doing with our minds. It doesn't have as much to do with what we're doing physically or verbally, though we can have manifestations of misbehavior with those. It's mostly the door of the mind that dictates whether it's virtuous or non-virtuous. So do all of your mundane actions. Again, these are set out. You can find a little bodhicitta mindfulness book it's kind of a PDF file with all of these different practices in them. They're also in the prayer book, the original FPMT prayer book, and so on. And even in Bodhisattva Attitude, there's some commentary on that, the free book from the Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive. So this verse, yes, if we are doing something meaningless, especially that may harm other beings, well then be very diligent and attentive to that. If you're going to start digging in the dirt, well, maybe you can do it a bit more gently so that if there are worms in the dirt, you're not slicing them in half and killing them and what have you. Try to be attentive to what you're doing, mindful of what you're doing, but also bring some awareness of bodhicitta to it. So that you can at least transform those actions into something a bit more virtuous. So any comments up to this point? Because we're about to enter into a little bit longer section. Again, if you have a question and want to unmute your mic, you can unmute your mic and ask it, or yes, who's talking?
It's Francesco. Hello.
Hi, Francesco. Okay, good.
My question is going back to the verse 34.
Okay.
And if you can tell me better or the differences between the verse 34 and the verse 40.
Okay.
They are similar, and I'm not sure if I'm getting all the nuances and differences between mind, body, and in those two verses.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Francesco. Let me try to address your question. So again, in verse 34, the idea, even if we look at the outline heading for that, because this is under investigating the actions of body and speech. Well, our body and our speech don't act without our mind being involved. Of course, I know there are some people, like with their speech, they have Tourette's syndrome, where they start saying things that they're not mentally creating. There's some sort of wiring problem in their brains that are causing the speech to be uncontrolled. But for most of us who don't have such a situation. So we're talking about the ordinary beings who their mind is very much connected to their speech and to their physical actions. Then we do have to check up as part of guarding the behavior of our body and speech, what's going on in our minds. So that's where verse 34 was set out as this first outline within how we look at the actions of our physically and verbally, is to make sure that we've got the proper motivation starting in our minds. So it was saying, if I pull up that verse on the screen, we can talk about it a little bit more. I've got another version of it here in front of me from the Gyaltsep J's text. Let me go back to 34. Again, this is the one where we went into the 8 worldly concerns. When at the beginning, having known that such a mind is with fault, at such a time like a piece of wood, I should remain, being able to rely upon the antidote. So it's in the context of when I'm in a situation where I might physically or verbally go down the pathway of non-virtue. I have to sort of at the beginning, before I'm even out among people, before I'm even in the situation, as much as possible, try to check and see if my mind's in the right place, that my mind is ready to have the proper motivation, to not have it be about worldly concerns, to have it be mostly about my concern to benefit others and so on, all of the Bodhisattva concerns. If I've checked the mind first before I go out and am subject to whatever is going on, whatever I might meet, then if I'm together with something that is faulty, if I find that my motivation is faulty, then the idea is to remain like a piece of wood, to not act, to not say anything, to not do anything, because I'm seeing that my motivation is impure. But as much as possible, we do want to have a mind that is having the proper motivation to begin with. This is why we talk so much and emphasize so much in this tradition, setting our motivation at the beginning of the day, right? If you have that strong wish to benefit others, then hopefully you can carry that over into your day and your mind won't be at fault. But if at the time when you're meeting something and somebody is criticizing you, for example, and suddenly you see that you're attached to your strong wish, to not be criticized, to only have people praise you, to only hear delightful, wonderful things. Well, then if we recognize that that's what's going on, is that that mind is arising that is having an aversion to hearing those words of criticism because I'm so attached to this view of myself. Well, then it's at that point I'm like a piece of wood, so I don't say anything back that's critical of them, so that I don't do something like, haul off and punch them in the face because they criticize me, whatever the case might be. So that verse was really about, as much as possible, we do want to keep our mind in a positive state. But if we look and we check at the time when we're being triggered by something and we see that we're being motivated by worldly concerns, then be like a piece of wood. A piece of wood isn't going to act. A piece of wood isn't going to speak. It doesn't mean we don't think, because again, sure, pieces of wood don't think either. But the idea here is we have to check up our minds. If we go then to verse 40, verse 40 I think has a bit of a different sentiment because it's in the section about investigating the mind. Yes, we are looking then at what's happening with the mind. But nonetheless, here the idea is that wherever we're at, whatever is going on, we do have to make sure that we have that mindfulness. This is, in my mind, kind of the prelude to what we had in verse 34. Verse 34, as I said, was talking about when you do meet those situations. Yes, you may have, tried to have some mindfulness of Dharma earlier in the day, but if you meet the situation and your mind's gone astray and you've got attachment to your reputation or to praise or whatever the case might be at that point, then be like a piece of wood. This is the advice that we need to go even deeper in making sure that we investigate the mind to maintain our mindfulness of the Dharma, to have that recollection of the Dharma as much as possible. They're absolutely related. I don't think they're identical because the one is talking about the verse 34 about what we need to do in the face of something we're experiencing physically or verbally, that we then need to keep our behavior in check by being like a piece of wood, having looked at what our mind was doing. This is more like the investigation because everything starts from the mind. We investigate the mind and make sure that the mind is as much as possible in the space of Dharma, so that we then don't have our behavior following from that. But as I said, this is in the section, verse 40 is in the section on investigating the mind, not looking quite as much at our behavior physically or verbally. I don't know if that helped, but
Yes, yes. a lot. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Good. Any other questions?
Yeah, quick question. So, thank you, Francesco. So I've been trying to do investigation, like if you get your mind stuck, so it's not a behavior, but like you stuck on a thought.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that verse 40 is a good way to use introspection to say, okay, now, this is a delusion, let it go?
Yeah, and as much as possible, look at, again, is my mind tied to Dharma right now? And of course, if we are following a delusional thought, if we're getting caught up in all the pride of being, our view of ourselves and other people saying negative things about us, and then we can investigate and say, have I tied my mind, like it says in that verse, my crazy elephant mind, to the pillar of the Dharma? And then, of course, if we are intent upon not just avoiding our own suffering by following the mind of pride and saying things that are negative to that person or damaging them in some way, but moreover, we recognize that our own pride is going to be an obstacle to our benefiting that being or other beings, then that's how we tie it to the Dharma. That's how we get back in touch with what it is that is supposed to be guiding us at that time. Whereas we've let the delusions take over. They're in charge and they're directing us in that instance. So does that make some sense?
Yeah, but even if it's just internal, let's say, oh, I
Yeah.
shouldn't have said that, or I could have done better. You could just say, this is the elephant as well, that it's self-inflicting or would be different.
I mean, I think at times like what you were just saying about, I could have done better. Well, I don't think that that's always necessarily a negative mind. But if it becomes obsessive and we start feeling really bad about ourselves and putting ourselves down, then that's not very productive.
No.
But again, it depends upon what thoughts are accompanying those. We can often have a mind that really is intent upon doing better so that we continue to progress on the path, and that can be very healthy. That's kind of even a bit of what we call our joyous effort, our enthusiasm, so that we continually make progress. But sometimes that can become problematic, and I know you've brought up previously some of the things that get in our culture, like last week when we talked about guilt and these things in our culture. In our culture, sometimes that is a mind too that becomes problematic for us, right? Because it does the same thing. It kind of says, oh, I could be doing better, therefore I'm not doing well at all, and therefore I'm a pretty lousy practitioner, and therefore what the heck am I doing?
Right. I should study more or whatever. Yeah.
But if it's a positive thing, if it's really trying to help us, then that's more of, again, that voice of reason that's actually looking at it and saying, I actually need to improve. I remember I mentioned last week this idea of compassionate self-discipline. This Cheryl Huber, this Zen teacher who wrote a book called Making Change for the Making Change for the Good, I think is the name of it. Anyway, she talks about compassionate self-discipline in there, and her idea behind it is that it is discipline, because we do need discipline on the path. We're never going to make it all the way to enlightenment if we don't discipline ourselves to some degree, but it's compassionate self-discipline. It's making sure that we look at ourselves through that lens of, I don't want to suffer, therefore I don't want to be following these negative minds, and I don't want to be getting caught up in behavior that is unskillful, that causes me to suffer in the future. But, and then also we do embrace others within the scope of this, but it initially starts with looking at ourselves and having compassion for ourselves and seeing that why we want to do better is because we don't want to suffer. And then why we want to do better eventually too is because we don't want others to suffer and we want to be able to benefit them. But it's never, we want to discipline ourselves because we think we're lousy people or because we hate ourselves or whatever. It's always done out of that space of self-compassion.
I found the book. I will order it. Thanks.
Okay, it's a clever little book. It's not very long, and I found some bits more interesting than others. But it's kind of nice, the idea of compassionate self-discipline. It's a nice way to put it, because it isn't, again, that we don't need discipline, because we do. We definitely do. So.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Andrea.
So I have a question, Don.
Sure, George.
I'd like to reconcile the stanza 34 about unmovable like a piece of wood with the 8th verse of thought transformation, the 3rd verse.
Mm-hmm.
It actually doesn't tell you to stay as a piece of wood, but basically whenever an afflictive emotion arises, endangering myself and others, I will firmly face it and avert it.
Right.
So it requires me not to be unmovable, but it requires me to actually search and act on it.
Okay.
So can we reconcile those two?
Mm-hmm. Sure, and I think that again they're not contradictory, because when we talk about being like a piece of wood and not moving, it means not moving in the direction of doing the non-virtuous thing. You know, a piece of wood again isn't going to yell back at somebody if someone yells at the piece of wood, "Oh, you stupid piece of wood." The wood's just going to sit there. So we're not talking about not doing anything. I think I mentioned that a little bit when we went through the verse, that it's not like this verse is meant to say shut down completely so that you don't even have anything going on mentally. Mentally, you want to be introducing more virtuous thoughts. You want to be introducing things like what you were just mentioning in the third verse of the 8 verses, which is to try to develop the antidotes that confront and avert any of the afflictive thoughts that are causing one to want to yell back at the person that yelled at you, or physically harm the person who physically harmed you. So I agree with you. I think that the third verse of the 8 verses is giving a deeper instruction about what we do with our minds at that time, so that we then don't engage in physical behavior or verbal behavior that is non-virtuous. This verse 34 is simply giving us the instruction that has to do with refraining from doing the physical or verbal thing by not moving in that direction, being firm and stable in terms of our being set against having any of those non-virtuous behaviors arise. So while that's going on, absolutely, we want to have what the third verse says in the 8 verses, the active confronting and averting the delusions, which means introducing antidotal thoughts, introducing more virtuous ways of looking at things, so that we then don't have present the delusion that will lead us down that pathway of doing something that's harmful to others. So I think they're reconcilable. I don't think that, again, this idea of being like a piece of wood, we're going to explore this more because it's coming up in the verses that we're going to see around 40, 51, I think it repeats. There's going to be more advice, even 50, 49. I mean, all of these verses are kind of giving us more instruction about how we should stay like a piece of wood. But even I'm going to share when we get to that some of the advice from Pema Chodron. Pema Chodron, she doesn't talk about it from the point of view of, oh, then you just shut down and you don't do anything and you don't even worry about what's going on in the mind, because as long as you're keeping your mouth shut and keeping your hands to yourself, then there's no problem. That's our first line of defense, is, stop harming other people with our speech and with our physical actions. So if we're like a piece of wood in that context, bravo. But in terms of what's going on mentally, we want to be very actively involved in that. Yes, we're going to be moving, we're going to be going and analyzing it and looking at it going, where is that thought coming from that's causing me to want to retaliate against that person, and so on. So I think they're reconcilable. Does that help?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, good. So we're a little bit over our allotted time, so I think we'll have to conclude for tonight. So again, we made it up to verse, what was this, 41. We'll continue with verse 42. And again, I will do my best to make it through all these verses in our remaining 4 sessions. It's hard with the hour and a half that we have, and I want to entertain questions. And I don't want to, in any way inhibit the learning, because the learning does happen through the questioning and investigating this material. So we'll have to find a balance for that. But yeah, we do have some sections where perhaps we can go through verses a little bit more quickly, but I'm fine with whatever happens. So good. Yeah, there's a comment that I'm going to need to look at on the chat box, but let's do the prayers first, and then I'm going to end the teaching for tonight. So let's do the dedication prayers that we do generally after this class, beginning with the first one that's on the screen, where we dedicate all the virtue that we've created for the benefit of all beings. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. Then we would dedicate so that bodhicitta will grow very deeply in the hearts of ourselves and all beings, especially our leaders at this time, the world leaders who need to have in their heart this motivation of compassion for all beings. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Then we make the prayers for our teachers, recalling that we extend this out to all spiritual guides and all traditions, all those beings who are dedicated to helping sentient beings to be free from their suffering, to have some measure of a practice of morality, and so on. May these guides have good health and long lives, and may we and others always have perfect guides in our lives. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Then for Lama Zopa, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Then lastly, just dedicate for those who you're holding in your heart right now. No doubt many of you know people who are dealing with the COVID-19 and having people who have died, people who are ill right now, or might even be dying, those who are dealing with the fear of this illness, whatever might be going on for people around the illness. We pray for their welfare, and also for anyone else we have in our lives who are experiencing obstacles or illness, who are dying or who have died. Make strong prayers dedicating for the welfare of these beings, that they may be free from their suffering and that they may find true peace and happiness. And we pray for the same for all sentient beings, that they may find perfect peace and happiness. Okay, thank you all so much. And again, I'm going to go ahead and end the recording, but I'll stay on for just a little bit for the chat box. So, good.